It's great to be here. I've heard so much about the Common Good Cafe and seen of the terrific presenters over the years, and have collaborated with Pastor Rich for so long. It's great to finally get a chance to join with you tonight. I have been involved in living wage work, specifically in Washington State since 1998, when I helped to coordinate living wage efforts in the state of Washington, working with people like Mark McDermott. And we had three principles for this living wage effort: the strong social safety net, upward mobility for all, and the right to organize and bargain collectively, and to help lift up all people. I bring a faith perspective that trying to bring a moral voice to this scandal of a lack of living wage in our community. As a night where many people who are involved with churches are at church tonight, I'm going to quote from at least one of the people who have written recently who inspire me around the concept of living wage, and then to talk a little bit about the backdrop that leads the Church Council of Greater Seattle to be engaged in not just the effort for a higher minimum wage in Seattle, but for the values that draw us to stand for a sufficient, sustainable livelihood for all people, a sufficient, sustainable livelihood for all people, because this is ultimately, it's a moral issue and a human issue, and one that we have to organize and bring together people around. And in fact, we have several efforts that we are involved in with community members and with congregations to lift up the idea of living wage for all in this year of 2014, when the debate is hot and heavy about $15 an hour. Just as we recall that just a year ago, the idea of $15 an hour was a pipe dream. I was part of an interfaith setting, meeting with the CEO of Alaska Airlines, and I was the person who first presented to him the concept of $15 an hour for the fuelers and cabin cleaners who were with me, and who were talking about the conditions under which they worked and struggled. And while there was immediate acceptance to say, how can I help the social conditions and improve the worker conditions, we soon found out that the economy of our airlines is built on having subcontracted workers who make a substandard wage. And so it would tilt the economics and the profitability of the airline to pay workers a $15 an hour wage. Well, the workers organize, and so we have it where the workers surrounding the airport are making that right now, and it's being litigated so that the airport workers also get to the standard which the voters stood for. And before we knew it, the mayoral candidates were falling over themselves about $15 an hour. Not that the concept was not good, but who was going to do it first and who was going to do it better. So we've come a long way on that matter. So as a night where people are in at least the Christian community are in churches, I thought I'd quote someone who's come to have a great reputation for standing with those who are poor, and that is Pope Francis, who's become something of a rock star on issues of the economy. So I thought I'd quote from him as we start off tonight. He has a section that says, "No to an economy of exclusion. Just as the commandment, 'Thou shalt not kill,' sets a clear limit in order to safeguard the value of human life, today we also have to say, 'Thou shalt not,' to an economy of exclusion and inequality. Such an economy kills. How can it be that it is not a news item when an elderly homeless person dies of exposure, but it is news when the stock market loses 2 points? This is a case of exclusion. Can we continue to stand by when food is thrown away while people are starving? This is a case of inequality. Today, everything comes under the laws of competition and the survival of the fittest, where the powerful feed upon the powerless. As a consequence, masses of people find themselves excluded and marginalized, without work, without possibilities, without any means of escape. And we're not let off the hook. A globalization of indifference has developed in our societies. The culture of prosperity deadens us. We are thrilled if the market offers us something new to purchase, and in the meantime, all those lives stunted for lack of opportunity seem a mere spectacle. They fail to move us. And he goes on to say that we need to dream, and our dream soars higher. What we need is not talking about ensuring just nourishment or dignified sustenance for all people, but also their general temporal welfare and prosperity. This means education, access to health care, and above all, employment. For it is through free, creative, participatory, and mutually supportive labor that human beings express and enhance the dignity of their lives. A just wage enables them to have adequate access to all the other goods which are destined for our common use. So with that in mind, I think we have some further moral sanction for a living wage in our community. So it's an exciting time because the concept of a living wage is one whose time has come within our community, and it's one that people have worked hard on for many years. Interestingly, and I come from a Catholic background, just to note that the concept living wage was the title of a book by Monsignor John Ryan in 1907 called The Living Wage, and hence that's how the concept became popularized and then adopted by people like FDR, who we'll talk about momentarily. Further inspiration, we're talking about our Rich in the introduction around our our ancestors. My grandfather came as an immigrant from Spain to New York City, and in 1922 he worked as a bellhop at the hotel a block from where I grew up for 25 cents an hour. Today we have a situation where we have a hotel worker who I know who worked for 27 years in the most prominent hotel in Seattle, and she was struggling for a living wage and said, you know, I'm making $9.75 an hour, and I can't make it on that amount. And then we heard about the concept of hotel workers who move 15, 16 rooms at a time in a shift. Now they have so-called heavenly beds that weigh 150 pounds to be able to move those mattresses, clean those rooms. And the stories of these workers saying they made something like $9.32 an hour. And this was in 2003. And $9.32 today is the minimum wage in Washington State. We have not progressed very far for those who are struggling to make ends meet. We've worked with janitors who have worked for many years, and I remember at night in downtown Seattle outside a big commercial office building having pizza with them. And it was a big success when they achieved a 3-year contract paying $11.95 an hour. And at that time, the biggest issue for these workers was having vacation so they could go visit their families in their home countries. And I was just talking with our friends before tonight and was saying in the state of Oklahoma that the governor not only said there could be no increase in, no law to mandate an increased or a living wage, but that there could be no law mandating vacation. Imagine that. Talk about the dignity of the human being and the dignity of the worker. So then we have Martina, who spoke recently at a forum on economic inequality. We'll talk about the Mayor's Committee on Inequality a little bit later. And Martina is working for the minimum wage at a fast food restaurant, McDonald's, and making $9 and change an hour, and she commutes 2 hours a day from Skyway. and asked what would $15 an hour do, means I don't have to live paycheck to paycheck. I might be able to achieve my dream of getting a BA and going back to school. I might be able to pay off some of my health bills that I have. I might be able not to work 2 jobs. That's what the difference is between $9.32 an hour and a wage that brings us toward that standard of a sufficient, sustainable livelihood for all. And even $15 an hour doesn't get us there. We'll talk about that a little bit later on. But we know we have a situation, and Mark McDermott will talk about this in a few weeks, where the State of Working America, an organization, recently stated that we know that wages are stagnating generally in our community. The cost of living is rising, purchasing power is declining, and productivity, nonetheless, is very high, in fact, the highest ever. But the workers are not receiving the benefits. And we know that from 2009 to 2012, the top 1% of our community got 95% of the gains. And in Washington State, the inequality growth is even more pronounced, even enlightened Washington State. So one speaker recently said, it's time to repair the wage floor that has rotted out. Time to repair the wage floor that has rotted out. So I think we have some work to do. Now, I like airplanes. I like the idea of flying, but it's important to say at what price. Now, we have heard recently about the $8.7 billion tax break that Boeing got to be able to theoretically preserve jobs in Washington State. But I want to draw us back our attention to a few years ago, 2003, when Boeing got a $3.2 billion tax break. And what was particularly galling at the time was that they insisted that unemployment be cut for 44,000 farm workers at the same time that they were getting the tax break. And the result was jobs went to South Carolina. Fast forward, $8.7 billion tax break, and we now know that 2,000 jobs are leaving the state as of today. So we have a system of inequality. We know we desperately need reform of our tax system in the state, where we have the most regressive tax system in Washington State, where the poor pay the highest percentage of their income in local and state taxes compared with the highest percentages of our system. The living wage helps to narrow that gap of inequality. It is but one step of a system of exclusion and inequality that we need to address, but we must take the steps that are in front of us. Franklin Delano Roosevelt said, "No business which depends for existence on paying less than living wages to its workers has any right to continue in this country." By living wages, I mean more than bare subsistence level. I mean the wages of decent living. And there you have it. We've strayed very far from these values. We know that Martin Luther King, in his last years, not only fought for civil rights for all people, but also for the rights of working men and women. He said all labor has dignity. Let us remind ourselves, not only Memphis, but we are reminding the nation that it is a crime for people to live in this rich nation and receive starvation wages. So we know that we have the moral mandate to work for living wages in our society and in our community. And so let's look for a moment at the issue of the increased minimum wage in the context of a living wage in our community. Now, I've given you a packet which we are sharing with community members and congregations around the community. And ultimately, we're inviting congregations and community organizations to, at a moment in June, to put up banners and to hang a display that says living wages for all. Imagine if 20, 40, 60 organizations at one point said living wages for all in this community. That would send a message to the powers that be that are deliberating around an increased minimum wage. Let me say, just by way of a little background, that what we have before us right now is we have a mayor's committee on inequality that is looking in confidential setting at proposals that would get us to a $15 an hour minimum wage at some point. We have the work of the 15 Now campaign in Shama Sawant that is working toward 15 hour in a more rapid, expeditious, and inclusive manner. And we have all sorts of gradations and competition within. So it's important that we look at a little bit the story of living wage and realize that it's one piece of the puzzle, and to remember from a principled standpoint that it is the dignity of the human person, the human being, the solidarity to stand with each other as brothers and sisters and not make each other into others, and the idea of the common good, hence the Common Good Cafe, that what is good for the community is a sufficient, sustainable livelihood for all people, and that we have a responsibility for each other. And when there is a gap of inequality such as exists in our community right now, that is to the detriment of the whole society, the whole commons, and we're the lesser for it. And shame on us if we don't work for a living wage within this context in the most powerful, wealthy nation in the world, when we have the opportunity to make it happen. And we all have some responsibility for it. We all have some opportunity. And so the invitation for us is not that we do everything, but that we do something and do it well. So I'm going to turn the page just to look at the concept of living wage ordinances. You might look at the blue sheet. And to note that the concept of a living wage as applied to city and state and county contractors, firms that do businesses with local jurisdictions, goes back to 1994, going back to the city of Baltimore. And it has sometimes applied to zones like airports or hotel zones like in Santa Monica, California. Citywide living wage ordinances have applied in cities more recently, in places like San Francisco, which right now has a wage of $10.74 an hour indexed to inflation, and it also has a paid sick leave law in place, and also a mandate where a higher wage needs to be paid if health care benefits are not provided. Recently, Santa Fe passed a living wage ordinance that raised the minimum wage by 65%. Studies have shown, and more recent studies that have come out in the context of the mayor's committee, that even with higher minimum wages in cities as big as San Francisco or as dramatic increases like in Santa Fe, that the effect on businesses going out of business, the effects have been absolutely minimal. And in fact, some of these cities have become more prosperous as a result. Logic holds. If people have more money to consume with, that's more money into the economy. If people are able to enjoy some leisure time and be able to sustain their households and to raise their children in the communities near where they work, the whole community benefits and the economy benefits. So this is why people like Nick Hanauer, the venture capitalist, is saying not only is a higher minimum wage a good moral issue, it makes economic sense too. So no credible study has said that a living wage is of detriment to the community. And believe me, there have been groups that have tried to create studies that have tried to diminish the impact of the living wage. So there is all the more reason to support a living wage. And there have been some instances of living wage ordinances in the state of Washington. The most recent one was related to city contractors in the city of Bellingham, which I and others worked, a group called Jobs with Justice worked on back in 2002. So let me go further and talk a little bit about, and because I want to make sure that you have a chance for conversation, I just want to point out to you this concept of the self-sufficiency standard. And you can take a moment and fill it out if you like. But what I want to get to is the fact that if you could take a moment and guess what it takes to make ends meet without resorting to public or private assistance, it'd be an interesting exercise to look at your monthly costs, what it really takes for people who are struggling to make ends meet. People who are living paycheck to paycheck, who are choosing between the rent and health care, between food and child care. It costs a lot to live in Seattle. It costs even more to raise a family in this area. So what does it take to pay for housing, a rent, an apartment in Seattle? Just throw out a number. What's a rent around here? What do you think a rent for a two-bedroom apartment is? $1,500. That sound like a reasonable figure? So if you're making $9.32 an hour, how can you afford to live in this community? So housing, say you want to rent a two-bedroom apartment. Say you have a preschooler paying for childcare. Say you're paying food costs, and maybe in your neighborhood, you don't have a QFC or Safeway right down the street. We have had neighborhoods without grocery stores for years, and you're aware of that. What if we have Metro service cut back by 17%? What about if health care is not provided? And other costs of living, cell phone, other things that, clothing, things that cost. How much do we think it would cost to make ends meet? And related to if you're making $9.32 an hour times 2,000 hours a year, you'd probably come up with a number not only at $15 an hour, but somewhat higher. So you could experiment with this, but I'm gonna jump ahead and cheat in sort of responding to the question. Now, I've provided you the most up-to-date data on self-sufficiency wages. Brianna Frenchmore, our intern, has been working on this. So if you look on the back sheet where it says King County, the latest job gap report suggests that for a single adult with some to meet basic needs, to pay your taxes, and with a little bit of savings, you need an hourly wage of $17.55 an hour to make ends meet. Diana Pierce at the University of Washington, who I worked to promote her self-sufficiency standard around the state of Washington several years ago, has done a scientific study of every county in Washington state and every major municipality. And she's done this for most states in the United States. And she suggests that if you have 2 adults and 2 children, each adult needs to make a wage in Washington, in the Seattle area, of nearly $15 an hour. Not just 1 adult, but 2, in order to make ends meet for a family. So when we say $15 an hour, we're not talking about a wage that's outlandish. We're talking about a one that allows people to live in dignity in our community in 2014 in the United States of America. Is that too much to ask? Is that too much to ask? All right. So, could we pass around the sheet? So I want to just take us momentarily to look at the discussion, and this letter will, a sample letter which I'll share with you in a minute. Let's look at the tentative timeline for a $15 an hour minimum wage in Seattle. Now, the Mayor's Committee on Inequality is having another closed-door session tomorrow. And they are looking at how to get to $15 an hour, which is what the mayor said. Even the mayor himself is expressing some discomfort about the lack of progress of the committee. Why? Because the committee is made up of a balance of the whole of society in there, and we're looking at people who have interests to say, well, we should count tips as wages, and therefore those workers in the restaurant and hotel industry should not be given a living wage. They should count what's called tip credit as part of their wages. We have others who say, well, it shouldn't apply to this set of workers or that set of workers or to certain nonprofits. But I'll tell you that one of the leaders of the Downtown Emergency Service Center said recently that it would essentially be an injustice if this higher minimum wage did not apply to all, if you start segregating out one group or another group. So the Mayor's Committee is supposed to come up with a proposal by the end of the month to the mayor. Then it's supposed to go to the City Council for deliberation. Meanwhile, the 15 Now campaign is looking at how to move concretely in an expedited fashion, apply to all, to a $15 hour wage. And the latest proposal, and some of this is shifting ground, but they are proposing that there's immediate movement to a $15 an hour for those companies with over 250 employees and more, and for those with less, that there would be a graduated scheme that would lead to $15 an hour in a short amount of time. The point is, we need to have movement forward to $15 an hour for all now in 2014. There is a lot of politics at play here. And this is why I've spent time talking about, from a principled basis, why we need to move forward. So it is not this effort, as many have written, there's a lot of effort, and Seattle, more than any other place, is good at charitable giving. And I, on behalf of faith communities, we are at the forefront of providing assistance around homelessness and food for the hungry through food banks, and that work needs to continue. But beyond direct service, there's another foot of social justice, and that is social change. And we need both feet to walk, direct service and social change, the 2 feet of social justice. And so there has to be movement where the solution to poverty is not charitable giving and ever more charitable giving, but a measure of justice that gives the dignity that is the due of every human being. Fundamental humanness, child of God, creature just like us, not an other, but a brother, but a sister. So let me I'm going to conclude shortly because I know we're going to have a good discussion here. I decided to weigh in with the Mayor's Committee and the City Council. The debate will occur at the City Council level. So one action that we can take is to write and be in touch with our members of the city council and the mayor, because they are going to deliberate this issue. And they're not all of one mind, but they also have open minds as well, and we need to speak with them. The mayor is going to be considering a number of factors, trying to weigh and balance different competing interests. The 15 Now campaign may be putting an initiative to the ballot, and that may be considered in November. But in this meantime, we need to weigh in with some clear thinking on the imperative of moving forward to a $15 an hour minimum wage at this time. And whether it takes a couple of steps to get there, but it matters whether you look at if tip wages, if tips are counted as wages, if you create a separate youth wage, if you create a training wage. These run, in our minds, counter to the concept of a citywide minimum wage. It matters whether there's compliance and enforcement of such a measure. We know that there is an issue of wage theft in our communities. And if you're an undocumented worker, you can be subject to exploitation, and you have to find a way to enforce the law. And so there needs to be a dedicated effort to that. We're conscious of the fact that nonprofits are trying to serve those who are struggling to make ends meet. But rather than to create an exclusive category for nonprofits, why doesn't the city bring sectors together to say, how do we provide some additional resourcing to those nonprofits to do the services they provide, and they pay their workers justly? And this applies to congregations as well. I've had to look at the Church Council of Greater Seattle, how we compensate our employees. And believe me, in my position, I've had to struggle at times with how to make ends meet. But that's part of what we're about. We have to look at our own communities, the affiliate groups that we're part of. How do we support this concept of a living wage? And we need to be able to speak to the fact that if it works in San Francisco and Santa Fe, it can work in Seattle. The studies confirm it. We also know that we have the principle that no one who works full-time ought to live in poverty. That's just a travesty in our society in this day and age. We need to look at the fact that whether it's two adults working at $15 an hour or a single adult making $18 an hour, the movement should not just be toward a $15 an hour, but toward a living wage that allows people to be able to have child care, to be able to have access to transportation, and importantly in Seattle, with the loss of affordable housing, the ability to live in some proximity to where you work. And that is a big issue. So on the back side of the draft letter, which I invite you to adapt, amend, make your own, and send to members of the City Council over the next couple of weeks, that to expand the notion of minimum wage to living wage, we need to call on the city to do an inventory of low-income housing in our community and to see what the displacement has been, and to commit to no more net loss of housing within our community. We need to look at supporting nonprofits to do the work that they do, but not by creating a separate wage, but by creating supports to help them to do what they're doing well. We need to create incentives so that there is local hiring for local jobs, especially in communities that are disproportionately affected. Because for some communities, the issue is not just a job that pays a living wage, but a job at all. And we know that we still have systems of exclusion where somehow communities of color continue to be excluded from contracts that they could do if they had access to them, particularly where our offices are in the Rainier Valley, Rainier Beach area, And that continues to be a struggle. So solidarity with those communities toward local hiring is a matter that matters to us. Making education accessible at younger ages so that people have the prospects of a solid future. And finally, supporting the initiative to allow people to still have metro services throughout the city and throughout the county so that people can get where they need to support themselves. So I submit this to you as some considered principles to look at the concept of not just a minimum wage, but a living wage. In the end, this is an issue, as we know, of not just an issue of an option, but it's a matter of life and death for people. It's a matter of dignity and what makes us truly human. It's a matter that is not only moral, but it's an issue that affects the well-being of our society and the future of our community. It's a wonderful opportunity. Seattle needs to take advantage of it.
Well, thanks everybody for coming, and I'm going to speak for maybe about 20 minutes or so, and then we'll have time for question and answer and break up in small groups and so forth. So I assume that everyone here is upset by the state of the world today. We have every right to be angry. We live in a world where 85 people own as much wealth as the bottom half of humanity. That's 3.5 billion people. We live in a world where billions live on $1 or $2 a day, and 30 million children die of starvation and malnutrition every year, where clean water is an unobtainable luxury for billions, while the grasping 1% sit on trillions of dollars in unused cash, where Boeing has stolen the pensions of, yesterday it was 30,000 workers, as of today it's 100,000 workers, at the same time as it has so much profit that it bought back $10 billion worth of its own stock, where our bus system struggles for years to find $75 million to keep service intact, while the lapdogs in the legislature of both major parties fall all over themselves to grant Boeing $8.7 billion in tax breaks in a matter of days. $8.7 billion, coincidentally, being the exact amount of the recent cut in the SNAP food stamp program, where the most essential and hardest working people, those who pick our crops, care for our children, sweep our floors, serve our food, clean our bathrooms, and care for our elderly, are paid the lowest wages, while those who speculate in stocks, make real estate deals, and bankrupt our economy take lavish incomes that would make the robber barons and the crowned heads of Europe of previous age blush and shame, where those who contribute the most get paid the least, and those who contribute the least take the most, where the richest nation in the world has the highest incarceration rate in world history, where black and Latino men can be expected to be stopped by police just because of their race, where there are more black men in prison today than there were slaves in the plantations of 1850, where capital is free to move anywhere it wants, and people are controlled, restricted, and jailed for trying to cross those imaginary lines on the map that we call national borders, where women are treated like sex objects to make a profit and are denied basic reproductive justice and freedom, where the LGBTQ people are bashed, fired, and generally discriminated against just for their sexual orientation and gender identity. Where imperialist rivalry, including the prospects of war, are ever present, as the crisis in Ukraine shows us today. Where most fundamentally, the 1% are willing to risk the destruction of the planet just to milk out the last dime of profit from fossil fuels. In a world where clean energy is abundant and we now have the technology to produce it. As historian Howard Zinn put it, the wrong people are in prison and the wrong people are free. Capitalism has always been exploitive and oppressive. It has always threatened humanity. As German revolutionary Rosa Luxemburg said 100 years ago, we face a choice of socialism or barbarism. In the light of the climate crisis and other capitalist-induced environmental crises, we can say the choice today is socialism or the threat of extinction. In the words of the global justice movement, another world is possible, and now we can add another system is necessary if we are to survive. Everyone in this room can come up with a long list of the horrors of capitalism. My talk tonight will contend that these horrors flow not from human nature or from greed or even the greed of the 1%, but from the economic system itself. I contend that we need to fight not just the evils of capitalism, but the system itself. And I'll try to explain why we need to replace it with socialism.
Steve, could we crank the volume up just a little bit somehow?
Oh. Am I not close enough? Is that better?
Let me see if I can crank this up a little. You're a much taller man than me. There you go.
Okay, there we go. Better?
Yeah, sing in there.
Okay. Okay. We all understand that capitalism, as currently constituted, is a threat to human life. But couldn't there be a kinder, gentler capitalism? Of course, throughout history, people have built mass movements that challenged even changed aspects of capitalism. The civil rights movement ended Jim Crow segregation in the South. Women in the U.S. briefly won abortion rights and legal equal pay, although real equal pay is still a long way off. Workers have won the right to have unions and better pay, Social Security, unemployment compensation. We even have a Clean Air Act and a Clean Water Act, which is supposed to protect the environment. So why can't we just keep this up and gradually turn capitalism into its opposite? There are two problems with this approach, which is called reformism or social democracy. The government under capitalism, whether in military dictatorship or a formal democracy like we have in the United States, is dominated by capitalist interests. Each government and governmental apparatus has to compete in the world with every other one. In order to control their territory, they need a strong military apparatus. To build a strong military, they need a strong economy. In the capitalist world economy, this means that each government must favor capitalist interests. That is the exploitation of workers and dividing workers against each other by using oppression. The reality of the world competitive capitalist system is supplemented by many other measures by which the capitalist class rules the political system. It uses its position as the economically dominant class to become the political ruling class. These include bribery, campaign contributions, using economic power to bend legislatures to their will, etc. A good example of this is the recent Boeing debacle in the state of Washington, where Boeing got all these tax concessions from both political parties. Overturning Citizens United would be a good step, but it would still leave the basic pro-capitalist bias of the government intact, because the pro-capitalist bias of the government is true all over the world and not just in the United States. Because of this dynamic, even when mass movements win reforms from the government, the capitalist class and its governments take back those reforms whenever the mass movement recedes. We see this today. The gains of the 30s and the 60s are either under attack or have already been rolled back. Welfare, unemployment compensation, Social Security, affirmative action, etc. Since the Great Recession started in 2007, austerity has ripped through every level of government at the state, local, and national level around the world. Whether these governments are called social democratic or even open capitalist governments like the United States. Nearly 100 years of social democratic governments in Europe have not changed the fundamental drives of capitalism. Even the most solid social democratic states in Scandinavia are cutting their social programs in the face of the world economic crisis. But there's an even deeper reality to capitalism. It is a fundamentally competitive system. Each corporation must maximize its profit in order to survive. It has to have as much money as possible to buy the most modern machinery possible, to sell its goods as cheaply as possible. To do this, it has to cut corners on the environment, pay workers as little as possible. The wealth of capitalism is accumulated by exploiting workers. Workers are not paid the full value of what they produce. Their unpaid labor is accumulated as profit. No laws or other changes in capitalism can alter this fundamental dynamic. It can be reformed on the surface, but it cannot be reformed in a fundamental way. As the old saying goes, you can peel an onion layer by layer. You cannot declaw a live tiger claw by claw. Capitalism is a tiger, not an onion. So if it will take a revolution to get rid of capitalism, what kind of revolution would that be? Marx examined capitalism and saw that workers were the class that was exploited and on whom capitalism relied for its profits. Workers had the power to cut off profits and bring the system to its knees. Workers not only had the power to overthrow capitalism, but they had the interest in doing so. Capitalism rests fundamentally on exploitation and cannot exist without it. However, it also relies on the oppression of all workers. Workers in general are oppressed. They are told what to do by their exploiters and their agents the whole workday. They are denied the right to democratically control their lives. Their choices as consumers are limited by the capitalist need for profit. They are alienated from their work lives and from each other. Capitalism sees people as means to an end and treats people as such. This then spreads over to alienated human relations throughout the whole society. Besides this, workers who are especially oppressed, as women, people of color, immigrants, LGBTQ workers, etc., are treated as less than full human beings based on these characteristics. All told, a vast majority of workers are not only oppressed in general, but are especially oppressed as well. This gives workers both a fundamental power and interest in overthrowing capitalism. Of course, this is countered by the power of the capitalists over the means of mental production, the media, etc. It takes struggle and organization for workers to overcome capitalist conditioning. But over and over again, workers have risen up and overthrown or nearly overthrown the system. A short list of examples include Germany, 1918 to 23, China, 1925 to 1927, Spain, 1936, East Germany, 1953, Hungary, 1956, France, 1968, Chile, 1971 to 3, Portugal, 1974, Iran, 1979, Poland, 1980, Philippines, 1986, and of course the Arab Spring starting in 2011 and continuing today. In Russia in 1917, the revolution went further and actually got rid of the old governmental apparatus and created a workers' government and began to move towards socialism for a few years before the counter-revolution, which was led by Stalin. So what was Marx's alternative to capitalism? Marx looked at the history of working-class revolutions and came to some conclusions. When workers were organized and conscious enough, they would eliminate the capitalist governmental structure and replace it with a worker state, democratically controlled by the vast majority. Once workers took revolutionary political power, they would use that power to transform the economy, to take collective ownership and control over it. This would need ultimately to happen on an international scale to get rid of the competition between states. Everything couldn't happen at once, but workers would take control of the economy and shift its fundamental drive to human needs instead of profit over time. The market and competition would be replaced by democratic planning, public ownership, and workers' control. Of course, one of the most fundamental human needs is the need for a healthy environment. This would mean a rapid shift away from fossil fuels and nuclear power to clean energy. To be sure that the unity of the working class was not broken up, the workers' government would need to take radical and immediate steps to dismantle institutional racism, sexism, etc. Over time, as the economy developed, more and more abundance increased, money would lose its significance, importance, and finally disappear, along with class divisions. The work week would be cut drastically as the waste activities of capitalism, banking, real estate, stock market speculation, advertising, arms production, etc. are eliminated. Finally, in what Marx called the higher stage of communism, the guiding principle of society would become from each according to their ability, to each according to their needs. Leisure would increase. Then people would be able to develop themselves in an all-round way. As Marx put it, the free development of each is the condition for the free development of all. Or as John Lennon described communism in Imagine, one of my favorite songs of all time, imagine no possessions. I wonder if you can. No need for greed or hunger, a brotherhood of man. Imagine all the people sharing all the world. Imagine there's no countries. It isn't hard to do. Nothing to kill or die for. Imagine all the people living life in peace. This vision has nothing in common with what has often been called socialist or communist countries. Russia under Stalin, China under Mao, Cuba under the Castros. Marx's vision was fundamentally democratic. The key was to remake the relations of production, workers' democracy at work and throughout society. This would only happen if the workers did it themselves. This is why Marx called socialism the self-emancipation of the working class. In the so-called socialist and communist societies, a new ruling class exploited the workers in order to compete with the other capitalist states. They built up military power and developed the economy to accumulate and have the basis for a strong military. Stalin started the process by leading a counter-revolution against the workers' government in Russia in the 1920s. The later so-called communist societies were modeled on Stalin's. In all of these states, not only exploitation but oppression as well returned. A literary version of the overthrow of workers' power and its replacement by Stalinism is laid out in George Orwell's Animal Farm. For the reasons outlined before, social democratic parties have only modified capitalism. Now they have abandoned even the nominal goal of socialism, and they have largely adopted neoliberal policies. But is Marx's vision possible? It is for two reasons. Capitalism developed the technology to provide a society of abundance. With new technology that can provide clean energy, new organic farming techniques, etc., we could provide a decent living standard to everyone in the world without destroying the earth. The other basic force for socialism is the working class itself. It is the first class that produces collectively on a large scale and has the potential to provide for everyone. The working class has continually shown its potential to transform the system. Besides numerous examples of actual working class revolution that I just mentioned, history is full of the historic struggles against exploitation and oppression. Early strikes and union movements, the anti-globalization movements, starting in Chiapas in 1994, and then in Seattle in 1999, the Occupy movement 2 years ago, and finally the massive anti-austerity movements sweeping the world today. Bosnia, Greece, Spain, most of Europe, Latin America, Africa, and Asia. If workers' revolutions can lay the basis for a post-capitalist society, how can we here today contribute to that process? As noted before, workers have made several attempts at socialist revolution over the last 150 years. In the earliest attempts, capitalism wasn't developed enough to sustain a society of abundance. After Russia, the other revolutions never succeeded in getting rid of the old capitalist governmental apparatus and replacing it with the workers' democracy. The main reason they failed was the lack of a large enough revolutionary organization that could lead the process. The capitalists are highly organized and have all the physical and mental means of production at their disposal. To defeat them, workers too have to be highly organized. The socialist revolution cannot be willed into existence. Capitalism is a crisis-ridden system. A deep economic and social crisis will create a situation where, as Lenin put it, the ruling class can no longer rule in the old way, and the oppressed classes are no longer willing to be ruled in the old way. When this happens, the question will be, are workers well enough organized to carry through and take power? To be sure that workers will be ready, we need to contribute as much as possible to building socialist organization today. This is necessary not just to be sure we are organized when the revolutionary crisis comes, but also because a clear understanding of our goals can help to provide the best strategies and tactics and movements today. For example, in the movements of today, Marxists argue for no support to either major political party, mass struggle as opposed to terrorism or supporting politicians, the need to fight oppression now to unify the working class, support for all workers' struggles against exploitation, rejection of any support to imperialism, and support for self-determination of nations. And finally, founding all these movements on democratic principles, making sure that the people involved in them democratically control those movements. To contribute the most to bringing about a socialist transformation, socialists do three things. Participate in and build as much as possible any struggle against the evils of capitalism today. Learn from other activists they work with, and finally lay the basis for a revolutionary party by building socialist organization. The three are directly related. Revolutionary organization can help movements be more successful, and increasing movements against capitalism can create more conscious revolutionaries. So where does that leave the people in this room tonight? I would like to make three recommendations. First of all, continue and intensify the work that I know most people in this room are already doing in the movements that they're involved in. Secondly, seriously consider Marxism, revolutionary socialism, as an alternative to capitalism. Consider Marxism as a fulfillment of the progressive struggles against oppression, exploitation, war, and environmental destruction. Look into Marxism. Read about it. Talk to Marxists about it. And finally, if you decide that Marxism is the best way to transform the world in a healthy direction, seriously consider joining a Marxist organization. Do an investigation of the politics of the various groups that exist with a view to joining one. That's it. Okay, questions, comments, all that kind of good stuff. Yeah, basically, there has never been such a thing as pure, that is free market capitalism, like Milton Friedman writes about, or things like that, where everything is the market. Capitalism was created in some ways, in England anyway. There was a royal government which kicked peasants off the land and created a working class, which then allowed the rising capitalist class to employ workers in their factories and so forth. So it's never been a situation where we had a free market economy with very little government involvement and all that kind of stuff. That's a myth of the libertarians and people who support Milton Friedman's ideas and things like that. So what we have today is capitalism in the sense that it's dominated by capital. It's dominated by the drive for profit. It's a competitive system. And even if you had this kind of capitalist utopia where everybody had a small business and the government didn't interfere, the way capitalism develops, over time, concentration takes place. Businesses are driven out of business and they get bigger and so forth. And pretty soon you have monopolies that run things. And capitalists do not operate on principle. They operate on profit. So they're not going to go, oh, I'm a good libertarian, therefore I'm against the government being involved in the economy. No, they're going to go and bribe officials and get tax breaks and get good regulations and do all this kind of stuff. And they will always use the government for their own ends, no matter what. And so you can never have a situation where you have a pure free market economy where the government doesn't really interfere, because as soon as people get concentrations of wealth, they're going to go to the government and use the government to further their concentrations of wealth. So that's the way it's always going to be. So we live today very much in a capitalist society, I think.